For about 10 days in March, Russia was the luckiest country on the entire planet. And we mean lucky, cartoonishly lucky. Win the lottery on your birthday kind of lucky. Because over in the Middle East, things had completely fallen apart. The US and Israel had hit Iran. Hormuz, the choke point that moves a fifth of the world's oil, basically went dark. Tankers stopped. Prices went vertical. Half the planet was panicking about where the next barrel was coming from. And Russia's sitting there going, wait, we don't even use Hormuz. Think about that for a second. The biggest oil crisis in modern history just hit, and it skipped Russia entirely. Every Russian barrel suddenly worth a fortune. Buyers who had been ghosting Moscow for 2 years were back in the chat. And then, and this is the part that actually made our jaws drop, Washington itself quietly cracked the sanction doors open. Now we'll get to that. It's worse than it sounds. The war economy that was bleeding out in February, well, it was about to get the biggest cash injection of the entire war. Billions, real billions. The kind that buys another year of shells, another year of drones, another year of this thing dragging on. Putin must have thought that he hacked the universe. And then, on March 22nd, something at a port called Ust-Luga caught fire. And then again on the 25th. Then the 27th, the 29th, the 31st. 5 strikes, 10 days, 1 port. And Ust-Luga is just where it started. By the time the smoke cleared, 40% of Russia's oil export capacity was offline. The worst supply shock in modern Russian history. Not from sanctions, not from OPEC, but from drones. The Iran windfall, gone, burned, trapped in tanks that nobody could empty, on tankers that nobody could load. Russia thought that it found the loophole of the century, and Ukraine just set the loophole on fire. So how did we get here? How does a country go from winning the geopolitical lottery to watching its biggest payday literally go up in smoke in the span of a single week? Well, stick with us, because the full story is wilder than the headline. To understand why the strike hurt so much, you have to understand how broke Russia actually was when the Iran war started. And we're not exaggerating. By February of 2026, Russia's war economy was in its worst shape in 4 years. That's not our take. That's the Kiev School of Economics, looking at hard Russian Ministry of Finance numbers. Oil export earnings in February, $9.5 billion, the lowest since COVID. Think about that. The lowest revenue that Russia had pulled from oil exports since the pandemic literally shut down half of the global economy. And it gets uglier. Oil and gas revenues in January and February combined were down 47% year on year, almost cut in half. The Russian federal budget posted a deficit of 3.5 trillion rubles in just 2 months. A record. For a country fighting the most expensive war in its post-Soviet history, that's a terrifying number. SIPRI, the institute that tracks military spending around the world, estimated that Russia's federal funding for the war and other military expenses hit around 16 trillion rubles in 2025, around 7.5% of GDP. The 2026 budget was already being trimmed back, down to 14.9 trillion. Not because Putin wanted to, but because he had to. And here's the deeper problem that the Kremlin couldn't talk about openly. Oil and gas used to be the engine of the entire Russian state. Back in the mid-2010s, oil and gas revenue made up close to half of the federal budget. By 2025, according to the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies analyzing Russian Ministry of Finance data, that share had collapsed to around 23%, the lowest in 20 years. Russia hadn't stopped pumping oil, the world had just gotten harder to sell to. The price caps had bitten, and Moscow had been forced to lean on VAT, corporate profit tax, and squeezing the domestic economy harder and harder to make up the difference. Translation? Every single oil dollar that didn't make it through was carrying more weight than ever. The margin for error was now gone. One bad month at a port, one disrupted pipeline, one fire at a terminal, and the wheels start wobbling. The math wasn't working anymore, and everyone in the Kremlin knew it. But then came February 28th. The United States and Israel launched joint airstrikes on Iran, and almost overnight, the global oil map caught fire. The International Energy Agency, the world's most respected energy watchdog, didn't mince words. In its March 12th report, it called what was happening the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. In history, not this decade, not since the 70s, ever. Now here's why. Hormuz, that narrow strip of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, that normally moves about 20 million barrels of oil per day. That's roughly a fifth of every drop of crude consumed on planet Earth. The IEA reported that after the strikes, flows through Hormuz collapsed from 20 million barrels a day down to, in their words, a trickle. Gulf producers slashed total output by at least 10 million barrels a day because their storage was overflowing and there was nowhere left to ship. More than 3 million barrels a day of regional refining capacity went offline, either from direct attacks or because there was simply no way to get the product out. The IEA was so worried that it pulled the emergency lever. On March 11th, member countries agreed to release 400 million barrels of strategic reserves into the market. That's the kind of move that makes you think the system might actually break. To put 400 million barrels in perspective, that's roughly twice the size of any coordinated reserve release in IEA history. It's the agency emptying its piggy bank into a fire that it isn't sure it can put out. And every analyst watching the markets in early March was asking the same question. If Hormuz were to stay dark, who has the spare oil to fill the gap? The answer was uncomfortable. Not Saudi Arabia, whose own exports were tangled in Gulf disruption, not the U.S. shale patch, which was already running flat out. The only major producer with significant uncommitted volumes that could physically reach world markets without crossing a war zone was Russia. And that's when Russia walked into the room with a smirk. Because Russia doesn't ship through Hormuz. Russia ships through the Baltic, through the Black Sea, through pipelines into China, through Pacific terminals like Kozmino. None of it touches the Persian Gulf. So when Hormuz went dark, Russian oil suddenly became the cleanest, fastest, most available crude on the planet. Prices went up, way up. And every barrel that Russia could push out of a port was worth dramatically more than it had been a week earlier. The Kiev School of Economics, which had been calling Russia, quote, the most vulnerable in 4 years just days before, suddenly had to rewrite its entire forecast. In its March chart book, it warned that the Iran war could deliver Russia what it called an unexpected windfall, and that a longer war could dramatically inflate Russia's export earnings and budget revenues from oil and gas. Their scenario modeling put the swing at tens to hundreds of billions of additional dollars, depending on how long the chaos lasted. We're talking tens to hundreds of billions just falling out of the sky into the lap of the country running the war in Ukraine. You can almost picture the meetings in Moscow. The mood swing, the energy ministry, suddenly the most popular department in the Kremlin, the arithmetic on how many more shells, how many more Shaheds, how many more years. But it gets worse, a lot worse. And this is where you might want to sit down. Because Russia wasn't the only one helping itself to this windfall. Washington, the same Washington that spent 4 years trying to choke Russia's oil revenue, blinked. On March 12th, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control quietly issued something called General License 134. In plain English, it was a temporary authorization, valid through April 11th, that allowed buyers around the world to do business with Russian crude and petroleum products that had been already loaded on tankers on or before March 12th. CBS News reported it bluntly. The Trump administration was greenlighting purchases of Russian oil already at sea, because the Iran war had sent global prices spiraling and the world needed barrels, and fast. The country leading the sanctions campaign against Russia just opened a 1-month window to now buy Russian oil. Not because anyone's heart had softened, because the alternative, an out-of-control global price spike during the worst supply shock in oil market history, was scarier than the politics. And the timing wasn't accidental. The license was published the same day, March 12th, that the IEA released its emergency oil market report, calling Hormuz a once-in-history disruption. Within hours of the IEA pulling the alarm, the Treasury was greasing the rails for Russian crude already at sea to find buyers. Whatever you think about the politics of it, the message to traders was unmistakable. Don't worry about the legal exposure for the next 30 days, just move the barrels. For Russia, this was a gift on top of a gift. The Iran war had made every Russian barrel more valuable. The OFAC license had made every Russian barrel easier to sell. The price cap regime that had been quietly seizing Moscow's revenue per barrel for years was, in this specific window, taking a back seat to global panic. If you were in the Russian energy ministry on March 13th, you were probably running new spreadsheets and trying not to smile in front of your colleagues. Russia hadn't just got lucky with Hormuz. Russia had gotten lucky with Hormuz and gotten a written invitation from the United States to cash in on it. If you're following this, hit subscribe, because everything you've heard so far, the windfall, the sanctions carve-out, the billions about to flood back into the Russian war machine, all of that is the setup. The actual story, the part that flips this entire video on its head, starts right now. Now here's the catch that nobody in Moscow seemed to be thinking about clearly. A windfall on paper isn't a windfall in your bank account. To turn that high-priced crude into actual rubles in the federal budget, you have to physically move the oil out of Russia, through a pipeline, onto a tanker, and out a port. Now that does sound obvious, but it isn't, because Russia's oil export system has a brutal weakness, and it's one that gets worse the more efficient you make it. Almost all of Russia's western oil exports flow through 3 ports. Just 3. Primorsk and Ust-Luga on the Baltic, Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. Together, these 3 nodes carry the vast majority of crude and refined product going to international buyers. Reuters has been tracking this for years. Ust-Luga alone handles around 700,000 barrels of crude per day, plus enormous volumes of refined products, almost 33 million metric tons in the prior year. Primorsk loads around 1 million barrels of crude per day, including Russia's flagship Urals grade and huge diesel volumes. Now, these aren't dots on a map. These are arteries. You cut them, and the body bleeds. And someone in Kiev had been making a list. Ukraine's deep strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure isn't new. What changed in 2026 was the targeting philosophy. Instead of going after refineries deep inland, Ukraine started going after the conversion mechanism itself. The exact spots where extracted crude becomes cash. Loading arms, storage tanks, transneft pipeline nodes, the places where a single fire can paralyze a port for weeks. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, the dedicated drone branch that President Zelensky stood up back in February of 2024, have been quietly building reach. Long-range drones from Ukrainian manufacturers were now capable of flying well over 1,000 kilometers. The Baltic ports, which had once felt impossibly far from the front line, were no longer impossibly far from anything. And then, Hormuz happened, and the Russian export system that had always been valuable suddenly became the most valuable target on the planet. Because the more money was flowing through those terminals, the more devastating it would be to switch them off. Ukraine knew it, and on March 22nd, they pulled the trigger. The first strike on Ust-Luga came almost without warning. Ukrainian drones slipped through Russian air defenses and hit the Transneft-operated crude loading facilities at the port complex. Fires, damage, operations paused. 3 days later, on the 25th, they came back. 2 days after that, on the 27th, again. On the 29th, again. On the 31st, again. 5 strikes in 10 days. 3 industry sources told Reuters that the March 31st hit specifically targeted the loading facilities, the mechanical equipment that moves crude into the bellies of waiting tankers. Not just the storage, the actual machinery of the export. And that distinction matters more than it sounds, because storage tanks can be patched. Pipelines can be rerouted around a damaged section, but loading arms are precision equipment. The articulated metal that connects a tanker to the shore, that handles thousands of barrels a minute under pressure, that has to seal perfectly, or you have an environmental catastrophe on your hands. You don't fix that with a welding crew and a weekend. You order parts. You schedule downtime. You wait. And while you wait, the oil that should be flowing out of Russia at the highest prices in years just sits there. The Russians knew exactly what was happening. The governor of the Leningrad region, where Ust-Luga sits, kept issuing the same kind of statement after each strike. Drones intercepted, damage limited, operations resuming shortly. The denials were almost rhythmic, and Reuters kept reporting the opposite, citing industry sources who could see the loading stop in the tracking data. Tankers don't lie. When a ship that was supposed to depart with 80,000 tons of crude is sitting at anchor 4 days later, something's broken. But Ust-Luga wasn't alone. Ukrainian drones disrupted Primorsk, the million-barrel-a-day terminal further up the Baltic, for the first time ever. They hit Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. All 3 of Russia's major western export ports, the entire western face of Russia's oil business, lit up in the same window. Add in strikes on the Druzhba pipeline route that feeds Hungary and Slovakia, and the picture became unmistakable. This wasn't a raid. This was a campaign with a thesis. By March 25th, Reuters did the math, and the number stopped people cold. At least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity was at a halt. Around 2 million barrels per day, frozen. Reuters called it the most severe oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. Modern history. Not the worst week, not the worst month, the worst. Period. Think about that timing for a second. The IEA had just declared the largest supply disruption in oil market history because of Hormuz. Russia was supposed to be the country that benefited, and now Russia itself was experiencing the worst export shock in its modern history. In the same week, while prices were screaming upward, while every barrel was worth a fortune, while Washington had literally just opened a 1-month buying window. The cosmic irony of it is almost hard to process. Imagine winning the lottery on Monday, watching the bank wire transfer get processed on Wednesday, and discovering on Friday that your bank is on fire and nobody can get the money out. That's the week that Russia just had. Except the bank was a port complex on the Baltic. The wire transfer was 2 million barrels of crude per day, and the fire was Ukrainian drones that no Russian air defense system has yet figured out how to reliably stop. Every single condition that made the windfall possible was still in place. The barrels just couldn't move. You can't tax oil that's stuck in a tank. The Kremlin can't pay soldiers with crude that never reaches a buyer. The price could be $100 or $200. It doesn't matter if the loading arm is on fire and the tanker is sitting empty in the Baltic with nowhere to dock. The windfall was real, and the windfall was unreachable, all at the same time in the same week. Now, of course, we have to be honest with you, because that's the deal that we have on this channel. Russia's not finished, not even close. Yes, the damage is severe, but it isn't total. Reuters' own reporting noted that Russia does still have options: pipeline supplies to China, seaborne exports through a far eastern port of Kozmino, Sakhalin project shipments, supplies to Belarus. Together, those eastern and alternative routes still carry around 1.9 million barrels per day. That's not nothing. That's a lot. What it isn't, though, is a substitute. Eastern routes have their own ceilings, their own pipeline capacities, their own customer constraints. You can't suddenly reroute 2 million barrels a day of westbound crude through a pipeline to China that was already running near full. The oil has to go somewhere, and when it can't, it backs up. Storage fills, wells get throttled, and every barrel sold at a discount because the buyer knows you have nowhere else to send it is a barrel that doesn't fund the war the way it should. So no, Russia isn't collapsing tomorrow, but the map of what Russia can and cannot do just got smaller, more brittle, more dependent on routes that have their own vulnerabilities, their own choke points, and their own potential to be targeted next. And that's the part that should keep someone in the Kremlin awake at night. Because if Ukraine just demonstrated in a single 10-day window that it can switch off 40% of Russia's Western export capacity at the exact moment it would hurt the most, what'll happen next time? What happens during the next price spike, the next emergency, the next moment when Russia desperately needs every dollar that it can squeeze out of every barrel? The KSE called Russia the most vulnerable it had been in 4 years right before the Iran war started. Then Russia got handed a windfall that should have erased that vulnerability overnight. And then, in the span of 10 days, that windfall turned to ash in the tanks at Ust-Luga. In long wars, countries don't usually lose because they run out of soldiers. They lose because the systems that finance the war start to crack. The fuel runs short, the trucks stop moving, the shells stop arriving, the money stops flowing. It's almost never one explosion that ends a war. It's the slow, grinding realization that the machine that pays for the war can't keep up anymore. Russia just got a preview of that realization when prices were high, while the world was buying, while Washington was helping, and the system still failed. There's also a ceasefire to factor in. As of April 8th, the Associated Press reported that the United States, Israel, and Iran had agreed to a 2-week pause, with negotiations set to continue in Islamabad. If that ceasefire holds, prices come down. The windfall window starts to close on its own, which means the strikes on Ust-Luga didn't just deny Russia a payday during the war. They denied Russia what might end up being the only payday window the entire Iran crisis was ever going to offer. The clock was already ticking. Ukraine just made sure the cash register couldn't ring before the clock ran out. That is what burned at Ust-Luga. Not just oil. The illusion that Russia had figured out how to keep this war profitable forever. So we want to know what you think. Was this the moment the economics of the war shifted for good? Or is Russia about to find a new workaround, a new route, a new partner, and rebuild the windfall that we just watched go up in smoke? Maybe a deeper pivot to China. Maybe a quiet new arrangement with a Gulf state that nobody's watching. Maybe a fresh ghost fleet of tankers operating under flags that nobody can trace. The Kremlin has rebuilt its way out of corners before, and we wouldn't bet against it doing so again. But this time, the corner is smaller, the clock is louder, and the world is paying closer attention than at any point since the war began. Drop your take in the comments. We read every single one. And subscribe to Fall of Nations for more frontline breakdowns of the wars, the money, and the moves that are shaping the next chapter of this conflict. Because whatever Putin thought he had figured out in early March, he now knows that those ports are no longer safe. And in this war, when the ports go, the arithmetic goes with them.